The Westbrook Grand Hall buzzed with excitement on this warm spring evening. The charity gala had drawn the town's most influential people, all dressed in their finest clothes, jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. But the real star of the evening was the magnificent grand piano sitting center stage, a Steinway that had been specially brought in for tonight's performance. Alexander. Reed adjusted his bow tie as he waited backstage. At 35, he was at the height of his career, with critics calling him the most technically brilliant pianist of his generation. His tall, lean frame was draped in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his dark hair styled immaculately. Every detail about him screamed perfection, from his polished shoes to his manicured nails, tools of his trade that he maintained with obsessive precision. 5 minutes, Mr. Reed, the event coordinator said, peering into his dressing room. Alexander nodded without looking up from his hands, which he was flexing methodically. He didn't need 5 minutes. He didn't need preparation at all for a small-town charity event like this. The pieces he'd be playing tonight were far beneath his usual repertoire, selections he could perform half asleep. But his agent had insisted this would be good publicity, a way to seem approachable to the common music lover. The thought made him smirk. He'd spent years at the Moscow Conservatory, trained under the greatest masters in Europe, performed at Carnegie Hall 3 times. Now he was in, where was he again? Some forgettable town that probably didn't even have a proper music school. When they called his name, Alexander walked onto the stage with the confident stride of someone who knew his worth. The applause that greeted him was enthusiastic but untrained. These people wouldn't know the difference between a true virtuoso and a merely competent player. Still, he gave them his practiced smile and bow before taking his seat at the piano. His program was deliberately accessible, some Chopin, a bit of Liszt, ending with Debussy. Nothing too challenging for the unsophisticated ears in the audience. As his fingers flew across the keys with flawless precision, Alexander allowed his mind to wander to the upcoming international competition in Vienna. That was where he belonged, not here playing simple crowd pleasers for people who probably listened to pop music in their cars. He finished his final piece with a dramatic flourish, rising immediately as the audience burst into applause. 3 curtain calls later, he was finally able to retreat backstage, where the event organizer waited with a beaming smile. Mr. Reed, that was spectacular. Would you mind joining the reception? Our donors would love to meet you. Alexander suppressed a sigh. This was the truly tedious part of these events, making small talk with wealthy amateurs who fancied themselves music lovers. Of course, he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Lead the way. The reception was held in an adjacent hall, where tables laden with appetizers and champagne attracted clusters of well-dressed guests. As soon as Alexander entered, he was surrounded by admirers gushing about his performance. Your technique is impeccable, said an older gentleman who introduced himself as the head of the local bank. Such passion, commented his wife, though Alexander knew there had been little genuine passion in his playing tonight. Technical brilliance, yes. Emotional connection. He hadn't bothered. He moved through the crowd, accepting compliments with practiced grace while scanning the room for the least painful conversational partners. The event organizer kept close, introducing him to one important donor after another. Alexander played his part, shaking hands and making forgettable small talk, all while counting the minutes until he could politely leave. Have you met Mrs. Chen yet? The organizer asked, guiding him toward a table where several people were gathered. She's one of our biggest supporters of music education in the community. Alexander allowed himself to be led to the table, where a small group of people parted to reveal a woman in her early 40s. Unlike many of the ostentatiously dressed guests, she wore a simple blue dress, her straight black hair falling just past her shoulders. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance except perhaps the quiet intelligence in her dark eyes as they met his. Mr. Reed, this is Lily Chen, the organizer said. Mrs. Chen, our guest of honor, Alexander Reed. It's a pleasure to meet you, Lily said, her voice surprisingly melodic. I enjoyed your performance very much. Thank you, Alexander replied automatically, preparing to move on after the customary exchange of pleasantries. Your technical skill is truly impressive, she continued, but then paused, tilting her head slightly. Though I wonder if you connect emotionally with Debussy. His work requires such delicate feeling. The conversation around them suddenly hushed. Alexander felt a flash of irritation. Who was this ordinary-looking woman to question his interpretation? Debussy is quite straightforward, he said dismissively. The challenge is in the execution, which requires years of proper classical training. Lily's expression remained pleasant, but her eyes sharpened. I've always thought the challenge was in capturing the impressionistic quality. The feeling of sunlight on water in Reflet dans l'eau, for instance. Technical perfection serves the emotion, doesn't it? Several people shifted uncomfortably. The organizer laughed nervously. Mrs. Chen teaches piano to children here in town. She's being modest about her own abilities, is that so? Alexander said, unable to keep the condescension from his voice. He looked at her hands. They were strong and capable, but certainly not the hands of a true pianist. No expensive manicure, and he could see slight calluses that suggested manual work. And where did you study, Mrs. Chen? I took lessons growing up, but never formally studied at a conservatory, she admitted without embarrassment. Music has always been a joy rather than a profession for me. A hobby, Alexander clarified with a thin smile. The word hung in the air between them. Lily didn't flinch. Yes, a hobby I'm passionate about. One doesn't need certificates to love music deeply. Something about her calm confidence irritated Alexander beyond reason. All evening he'd endured the uninformed praise of these provincial music lovers, but this woman's gentle critique felt like an insult. Love without mastery is sentimentality, he said sharply. Anyone can feel something when they hear music. The art is in the creation, the execution. The tension in the air was palpable now. The organizer stepped forward, clearly trying to diffuse the situation. Well, we're just grateful Mr. Reed could share his extraordinary talent with us tonight. Perhaps Mrs. Chen would like to demonstrate her passionate approach? Alexander suggested, gesturing toward the piano that had been moved to the reception area. Since she has such definite ideas about interpretation, a shocked murmur ran through the onlookers. Lily's cheeks flushed slightly, but she held his gaze. That's really not necessary, the organizer began, looking mortified. No, it's quite all right, Lily said quietly. Though I'm afraid the comparison would hardly be fair. I insist, Alexander said, now committed to putting this presumptuous woman in her place. Please show us your emotional connection to Debussy. He stepped back, crossing his arms and watching with smug expectation as Lily hesitated. Part of him knew he was behaving poorly, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He had endured enough tedium for one evening. At least this would provide some amusement. The crowd parted uncertainly as Lily made her way to the piano. Alexander noted with satisfaction that she looked nervous, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear before sitting down. She took a moment to adjust the bench, her back straight but not rigid like a trained performer's. I haven't played for an audience in some time, she said softly, more to herself than to the room. But music is meant to be shared, isn't it? Alexander didn't respond, already regretting this impromptu challenge. The woman would embarrass herself, and then he would look like a bully. His agent would be furious if word got out. He was about to intervene to graciously let her off the hook when her fingers touched the keys. The first notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune floated into the suddenly silent room. Alexander's prepared condescension died on his lips as he watched her play. Her technique wasn't flawless. He could spot minor imperfections a trained ear would notice, but there was something in her playing that caught him completely off guard, where his performance had been technically brilliant. Hers was alive. Her body swayed gently with the music, her face transformed by complete absorption in the piece. The well-known melody seemed to take on new dimensions under her fingers, as if she were discovering it for the first time and sharing that discovery with everyone present. Alexander found himself holding his breath. This wasn't happening. This ordinary woman with her simple dress and untrained hands couldn't possibly be playing with such, he couldn't even find the word. It wasn't just emotion. Any decent player could affect emotion. It was authenticity. Her connection to the music was real in a way that made his own polished performance seem hollow in comparison. As Lily played the final delicate notes, the room remained in perfect silence for several heartbeats before erupting into spontaneous applause. She looked up, seeming surprised to find herself surrounded by people, a flush spreading across her cheeks as she smiled shyly. Alexander stood frozen, his face a careful mask hiding the turmoil inside. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: doubt. Not about his technical ability, he knew he was superior in that regard, but about something more fundamental. Something he feared might be far more difficult to master than any complicated piece of music. The crowd's attention had shifted entirely to Lily now, people gathering around her with genuine admiration. Alexander remained where he was, suddenly aware that he had made a terrible mistake. He had intended to put this woman in her place, to remind everyone of the gulf between a true artist and an amateur. Instead, he had only succeeded in revealing the limits of his own understanding. The applause for Lily finally died down, leaving Alexander in an uncomfortable silence. He hadn't moved from his spot, his practiced smile now feeling like a brittle mask on his face. People were looking at him with expressions ranging from embarrassment to disapproval. He had publicly challenged a local woman to humiliate her, and instead, she had shown him up with a performance that spoke directly to the heart. "That was quite lovely, Mrs. Chen," he managed to say, his voice sounding stiff even to his own ears. "Thank you," Lily replied simply, with no hint of triumph or smugness. This somehow made it worse. If she had been arrogant about her success, he could have dismissed her as lucky or overhyped by these easily impressed locals. But her humility was genuine, making her talent all the more undeniable. The event organizer, clearly relieved that the tense situation had resolved itself in an unexpected way, quickly stepped in. "What a wonderful surprise. I think we can all agree that music brings out the best in our community. More champagne, anyone?" The crowd's attention was diverted, allowing Alexander to slip away to a quiet corner. He grabbed a glass of water from a passing server, suddenly needing something to cool the heat of embarrassment rising in his throat. What had just happened? He had been playing piano since he was 4 years old, had won international competitions, had sacrificed everything for his art. How could this amateur with no formal training, make him feel so thoroughly outclassed? "Mr. Reed?" He turned to find Lily standing nearby, holding 2 glasses of champagne. She offered one to him. "I hope I didn't overstep," she said quietly. "It wasn't my intention to create an awkward situation." Alexander accepted the glass, more out of reflex than desire. "You play well," he said stiffly. "For someone without training." A small smile touched her lips. "I've had training, just not the kind that comes with fancy diplomas. My grandmother was my first teacher. She never had the chance for formal education but played like her soul was speaking through her fingers." Despite himself, Alexander was curious. "And after your grandmother?" "Different teachers here and there. I worked as a hotel housekeeper during high school to pay for lessons with a retired concert pianist who lived nearby. Then I cleaned the local music store in exchange for practice time on their grand piano." She shrugged lightly. "You find a way when music matters enough." Alexander felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. His own path had been privileged. Wealthy parents who hired the best teachers, who sent him to elite music schools, who never questioned the expense of his pursuit. He had never had to find a way. The way had always been cleared for him. "Why didn't you pursue it professionally?" he asked, genuinely puzzled now. "With your natural ability." Lily took a sip of her champagne before answering. "Life took me in different directions. My mother got sick when I was 19. I stayed to care for her. Then I met my husband, we had children." She smiled. "I don't regret my choices." "But you could have been on stages around the world," Alexander insisted, unable to comprehend choosing family obligations over artistic achievement. "Perhaps. Or perhaps not. The music world is competitive, as you know better than most." Her gaze was direct but kind. "Besides, I'm on a stage, teaching children to love music, playing at community events, sharing what I know. It's different from your world, but it has its own rewards." Before Alexander could respond, they were interrupted by an older gentleman who approached Lily with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Chen, that was spectacular. Reminds me of why we fought so hard to keep music programs in our schools. Young lady, you're the perfect example of why arts education matters." Lily smiled warmly. "Thank you, Dr. Harper. How's your grandson doing with his lessons? Practicing every day since you gave him that book of movie themes." "Smart move. He thinks he's just having fun." As they chatted, Alexander watched Lily with growing fascination. She knew these people, not in the superficial way he knew his audiences or patrons, but personally. She asked about their families, remembered details about their lives, connected with them through more than just music. "Mr. Reed, would you play something else for us?" Someone called out from the crowd. Perhaps a duet with Mrs. Chen? Alexander felt cornered. The last thing he wanted was another comparison between his technically perfect but emotionally sterile playing and Lily's imperfect but deeply moving style. But refusing would make him look petty and unsportsmanlike. Before he could formulate a response, Lily spoke up. "I think Mr. Reed has already been generous enough with his talent tonight. We shouldn't impose further." He shot her a grateful look, which she acknowledged with a slight nod. The party continued around them, but Alexander found himself unable to rejoin the general socializing. Instead, he drifted back toward the piano, drawn to it like a safe harbor in unfamiliar waters. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing down, feeling their smooth, cool surface. "It's a beautiful instrument," Lily said, appearing beside him. "Not many Steinways make it to our little town." "You made it sound beautiful," Alexander admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. "So did you." He looked at her sharply. "You don't believe that? You criticized my interpretation." "I questioned, not criticized," she corrected gently, "and only because I heard something in your playing that suggested you're capable of much more than technical brilliance." Alexander stared at her, unsure if he was being mocked. But her expression held nothing but sincerity. "May I show you something?" she asked. Without waiting for his answer, she sat at the piano and patted the bench beside her. After a moment's hesitation, Alexander sat down, maintaining a careful distance. "The passage in Debussy that you played tonight, it goes like this, yes?" She demonstrated the section with textbook precision, mimicking his interpretation perfectly. Alexander nodded, impressed despite himself at her ability to recreate his playing after hearing it just once. "But what if—" Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, as if she were feeling for something invisible. Then she played the same passage but with subtle differences, a slight lingering on certain notes. A barely perceptible shift in dynamics, a breathing quality that transformed the mechanical into the magical. "You see?" she said softly. "The notes are exactly the same, but the intention behind them changes everything." Alexander felt something shift inside him, like a door long shut creaking open just a fraction. He had heard similar advice from teachers over the years, of course, but had dismissed it as subjective nonsense, inferior to the measurable perfection of flawless execution. Now, hearing the difference so clearly demonstrated, he couldn't deny the truth in what she was showing him. "Your turn," Lily said, moving her hands away from the keys. Alexander hesitated. Don't think about it," she advised. "Just feel the music. What is Debussy trying to tell us with these notes? What was he feeling when he wrote them? Feeling foolish but strangely compelled." Alexander placed his hands on the keys and began to play the passage again. At first, he fell into his usual patterns, the muscle memory of countless hours of practice taking over. But then he tried to hear the music as Lily had played it, to find that ineffable quality that had moved the audience so deeply. He faltered, hitting a wrong note, something that hadn't happened to him in a public setting since he was a teenager. Embarrassed, he stopped abruptly. "That's actually good," Lily said, surprising him. "Making mistakes is good?" he asked incredulously. "It means you're trying something new, pushing past your comfortable boundaries." She smiled. "Perfection can be a cage, you know. It keeps you safe, but it also keeps you limited." Alexander didn't respond, but the words resonated with him in an uncomfortable way. Had his pursuit of technical flawlessness become a limitation rather than an achievement? The thought was interrupted by the event organizer, who approached with an apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry to intrude, but we're starting to wrap up for the evening, Mr. Reed. Your car is waiting whenever you're ready." Alexander nodded, suddenly aware that the crowd had thinned considerably. He had been so engrossed in his conversation with Lily that he hadn't noticed the time passing. "Of course." He stood up, straightening his jacket automatically. To Lily, he said, "Thank you for the perspective." She rose as well, smoothing her simple dress. "It was an honor to meet you, Mr. Reed. I hope you'll remember our little town fondly." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no hidden meaning. Just genuine warmth that made his earlier condescension seem even more shameful in retrospect. I'm performing in the city next month, he found himself saying. A more formal program. Perhaps you would be interested in attending. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. My assistant can arrange tickets if you contact this number. Lily looked surprised but pleased. I'd like that very much. Thank you. As Alexander made his final goodbyes and walked toward the exit, he felt strangely unsettled. The evening had not gone as expected, not at all. He had come to impress a provincial audience with his superior talent, and was leaving with questions about the very foundation of his musical identity. In the car, heading back to his hotel, Alexander stared out at the passing streetlights, Lily's words echoing in his mind. Perfection can be a cage. For the first time in years, he wondered if he might be ready to find out what waited beyond those bars. 3 weeks passed, and Alexander found himself in the middle of preparations for his upcoming concert series. The Grand Theater in the city was a far cry from the small-town charity event. Here in these hallowed halls with their perfect acoustics, he was in his element, or at least he should have been. Again, from the third movement, he instructed the orchestra conductor during rehearsal. Something wasn't right with the piece, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The notes were correct, the timing precise, but something was missing. After the fourth attempt, he waved his hand in frustration. Let's take a break. The conductor nodded, dismissing the orchestra members, who set down their instruments with barely hidden relief. Alexander walked to the edge of the stage and sat down, legs dangling over the side, staring out at the empty seats that would be filled with critics and aficionados in 2 days' time. He pulled out his phone and found himself scrolling to the contact information his assistant had added for Lily Chen. On impulse, he pressed call. Hello? Her voice sounded surprised. Mrs. Chen, this is Alexander Reed. He suddenly realized he had no clear reason for calling. Mr. Reed, this is unexpected. Is everything all right with the tickets? I was planning to drive up with my husband this weekend. The tickets are fine, he assured her. What was he doing? I wanted to ask you something about interpretation. I'm struggling with a piece. There was a pause, and Alexander could almost see her surprised expression. I'm flattered you'd ask me. What's the piece? Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. I've performed it dozens of times, but suddenly it feels mechanical. Ah, she said softly. That's a piece that demands your heart, not just your hands. That's exactly it, Alexander replied, surprised at how quickly she had identified the problem. I know every note perfectly, but it's not coming alive. What does the music mean to you personally? Lily asked. Not what it meant to Rachmaninoff or what critics say about it. What does it make you feel? Alexander frowned. No one had asked him that question in years, perhaps ever. His teachers had always focused on technique, interpretation based on historical context, the composer's known intentions. His own feelings had never entered the conversation. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe that's where you need to start, Lily suggested. Rachmaninoff wrote that piece after a period of severe depression. It was his comeback, his journey from darkness back to light. Have you ever experienced something similar? A time when you felt lost and then found your way? Alexander thought about his childhood. The pressure from his parents, the endless hours of practice while other children played outside. The competitions where second place was treated as failure. The gradual hardening of his passion for music into something more like obsession or obligation. Perhaps, he said quietly. Try playing it with that in mind, Lily said, not as a technical challenge to be mastered, but as a story you're telling, your story, filtered through Rachmaninoff's notes. After they hung up, Alexander sat for a long time, watching the theater staff clean and prepare the space. Finally, he stood and walked back to the piano. The orchestra members had left, but he didn't need them for this. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play, not thinking about the proper technique or the upcoming performance, but about his own journey. The dark passages reflected his moments of doubt. The triumphant crescendos echoed his successes, and the tender, quiet sections spoke of dreams he had almost forgotten. For the first time in years, Alexander lost himself in the music. When he finished, he was startled to hear applause. The conductor had returned and was standing in the wings, a look of amazement on his face. Whatever you just did, the conductor said, do exactly that on Saturday. The night of the concert arrived, and Alexander peered through the curtain at the packed house. His gaze stopped at a familiar face in the 10th row, Lily seated beside a kind-looking man who must be her husband. She hadn't mentioned they were coming tonight. He had arranged tickets for the Saturday show. A strange nervousness fluttered in his stomach. He had performed for world leaders and royalty without a second thought, but knowing Lily was in the audience made him feel like a student at his first recital. She would hear beyond his technical skill. She would know if he was truly connecting with the music or merely going through the motions. 5 minutes, Mr. Reed, the stage manager announced. Alexander nodded, taking deep breaths to center himself. When he finally walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. His reputation preceded him. He bowed automatically, then seated himself at the piano, adjusting the bench with practiced precision. The conductor raised his baton. The orchestra tensed in anticipation, and then they were off. The dark, foreboding opening of the Rachmaninoff concerto, filling the hall with its emotional weight. Alexander found himself thinking of what Lily had said about the composer's depression, about finding one's way back from darkness. His fingers moved across the keys with their usual precision, but tonight there was something more. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was feeling them, allowing the music to flow through him rather than simply from him. When they reached the famous second movement, with its achingly beautiful melody, Alexander closed his eyes. He thought about his conversation with Lily in the small town, about the way she had shown him that technical perfection was only the beginning of what music could be. The notes took on new meaning, becoming vessels for emotions he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. By the time they reached the triumphant finale, Alexander was playing in a way he never had before. There was still precision. He was incapable of anything less, but there was also vulnerability, humanity, life. The final chords resonated through the hall, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then the audience erupted. People rose to their feet, applauding wildly. Alexander stood and bowed, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. His eyes sought out Lily in the 10th row. She was standing with everyone else, but unlike the others who were clapping frantically, she simply stood with a gentle smile and nodded once as if to say, "Now you understand." The reception afterward was crowded with well-wishers, critics, and patrons of the arts. Alexander moved through them in a daze, accepting compliments and congratulations with distracted thanks. He was looking for one person in particular. He found Lily and her husband by the refreshment table, engaged in conversation with one of the orchestra members. "Mrs. Chen," he said, approaching them. "I didn't expect you tonight." Lily turned with a warm smile. "We decided to come for both performances. I hope that's all right. This is my husband, Thomas." Thomas Chen had a friendly, open face and offered his hand. "That was quite something, Mr. Reed. Even I could tell it was special. And I'm just the guy who listens to Lily practice at home. Please, call me Alexander." He shook Thomas's hand, then turned to Lily. "And what did you think?" "I think you found what you were looking for," she said simply. Before he could respond, a critic from a prestigious music magazine approached, notepad in hand. "Mr. Reed, your interpretation tonight was revelatory. Many of us who have followed your career have always admired your technical brilliance, but this was something entirely new. Can you tell us what inspired this more emotional approach?" Alexander glanced at Lily, who took a small step back, giving him space to speak with the critic. "I've been reconsidering what music means," he said carefully. "It's not just about playing the notes correctly. It's about finding the truth behind them." "Fascinating," the critic said, scribbling in his notepad. "And was there a specific influence that led to this artistic evolution?" Alexander hesitated, then smiled. "Let's just say I was reminded recently that music isn't something you perfect, it's something you share." After the critic moved on, Alexander turned back to Lily and Thomas. "Would you be free for lunch tomorrow? I'd like to continue our conversation about interpretation." Thomas glanced at his watch. "I've got to head back in the morning, work commitment." "But Lily's staying until Sunday." "I'd be happy to meet," Lily said. "There's a cafe near the music conservatory that I'd like to visit anyway. My oldest student is applying there next year." They arranged a time and place, and as Alexander watched them leave, he realized how much he was looking forward to tomorrow. Not for career advice or professional connections, the usual reasons he scheduled meetings, but for the simple pleasure of talking with someone who understood music the way Lily did. The cafe was busy when Alexander arrived the next day, but he spotted Lily immediately, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. She wore a simple sundress and looked completely at ease, despite being in the city instead of her small town. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "I've been thinking about our conversation ever since that night at the charity event." Lily smiled. "Your performance yesterday was beautiful. You played with your heart, not just your hands." "It felt different," Alexander admitted. "Better, more real somehow. That's because it was real. You allowed yourself to be vulnerable through the music." Alexander stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "I've spent my entire life pursuing technical perfection. My parents started me on piano when I was barely old enough to reach the keys. Every mistake was a failure. Every competition was a test of worth, not just talent." "That's a heavy burden for a child," Lily said softly. "It became normal. I didn't know any other way." He looked up at her. "How did you learn to play the way you do? With such freedom?" Lily's eyes grew distant with memory. "My grandmother never made music feel like work. It was joy. It was storytelling. It was how we expressed things too complex for words." She laughed lightly. "When I finally had a formal teacher, he was constantly frustrated with me because I kept asking what the music meant instead of focusing on proper finger positioning." "But you did learn the technique," Alexander pointed out. "Eventually. But by then the connection to the emotion was already established. The technique served the feeling, not the other way around." She took a sip of her tea. "That's what I try to teach my students now." "You teach children?" Lily nodded. "Mostly. Some adults too. People who always wanted to learn but never had the chance. A few serious students like the one applying to the conservatory. I've never taught," Alexander confessed. "I wouldn't know where to begin. You might enjoy it. There's something wonderful about watching someone discover music for the first time. Seeing that spark when they create something beautiful and realize it came from within them." For the first time, Alexander could imagine it, sharing what he knew, not to impress or compete but to connect, to pass along the gift that had shaped his life. It was a strange thought but not an unpleasant one. "I have another concert tonight," he said. "Would you like to come backstage before it starts? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Later that afternoon, Alexander introduced Lily to the young pianist who would be performing with him. A prodigy much like he had once been, technically brilliant but emotionally guarded. As he watched Lily gently draw the boy out, speaking to him not as a wonderkind but as a fellow music lover, Alexander felt something shift inside him once more. The cage of perfection that had held him for so long was beginning to open, one bar at a time. The weeks following Alexander's breakthrough performance were a whirlwind. Critics raved about his artistic rebirth and newfound emotional depth. Requests for interviews poured in, and his agent called daily with new opportunities. Everyone wanted to know what had changed, what had transformed the technically brilliant but emotionally distant pianist into this more complete artist. Alexander gave vague answers about personal growth and artistic evolution. He never mentioned Lily by name. Something about their connection felt too private, too valuable to share with the hungry media machine that wanted to package and sell his transformation story. But privately, they stayed in touch. Weekly phone calls turned into long email exchanges about music, teaching, and the balance between technical skill and emotional expression. Alexander found himself looking forward to these conversations more than the applause of audiences or the praise of critics. One morning in his Manhattan apartment, Alexander sat at his kitchen table reading a new email from Lily. She was telling him about a student's recital, a young boy who had overcome terrible stage fright to perform a simple Mozart piece. "He wasn't perfect," she wrote, "but he was brave." Afterward, his grandmother cried and said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. I wish you could have seen his face in that moment. He understood what music is really for. Alexander stared at those words for a long time. What music is really for? Had he ever known? Had he ever truly understood the purpose of all those hours of practice, all those performances, all those accolades? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his agent, Walter. "Great news," Walter said without preamble. "The International Piano Competition in Vienna wants you as a judge this year. It's a huge honor. They've never asked a pianist under 40 before." "A judge?" Alexander repeated, surprised. "Yes. You'll be helping select the next generation of concert pianists. It's perfect timing with all this press about your artistic evolution." The competition is in 3 weeks. So we need to— I'll have to think about it, Alexander interrupted. There was a pause on the other end. Think about it? Alex, this isn't something you think about. This is something you say yes to immediately and then celebrate. 3 weeks is short notice. I have commitments. What commitments could possibly be more important than this? Walter demanded. Alexander's eyes fell on his laptop screen on Lily's email. I promised to visit a friend, to see her students perform. A school recital? Walter's voice was incredulous. You're considering turning down the Vienna International Piano Competition to attend a school recital? I'll call you back, Alexander said and hung up before Walter could protest further. He sat for a moment, then composed a reply to Lily. I'd like to visit, he wrote. To see your teaching in action. To meet your students. Would that be possible? Her response came that evening, warm and welcoming. And just like that, Alexander found himself booking a flight not to Vienna, but back to the small town where he had met Lily Chen. The local music store where Lily taught was nothing like the prestigious conservatories Alexander was used to. The building was old, with worn carpet and walls covered in faded posters of musicians from decades past. But there was something immediately welcoming about the space, with its collection of instruments in various sizes and the sound of practice rooms in use down the hallway. Alexander, Lily greeted him with genuine warmth, emerging from one of the teaching rooms. I can't believe you actually came. Neither can my agent, Alexander replied with a small smile. He's still trying to convince me to fly to Vienna instead. Lily's eyes widened. The competition? You're supposed to be there? I was invited to judge. He shrugged. I decided this was more interesting. Lily looked like she wanted to say more, but just then a teenage girl appeared in the doorway of the teaching room. Mrs. Chen. I fixed that passage in the third movement. Wonderful, Grace. Lily turned to Alexander. This is Grace Tyler, my student who's applying to the conservatory. Grace, this is Alexander Reed. The girl's mouth fell open. The Alexander Reed? The concert pianist? Alexander nodded, feeling strangely self-conscious. It's nice to meet you, Grace, but why are you here? In our town? Grace looked between him and Lily in confusion. Mr. Reed is interested in different teaching methods, Lily explained smoothly. He's going to observe some of our lessons today, if that's all right with you. Of course. Grace's face flushed with excitement. Should I play the Chopin again? I've been working on the dynamics like you suggested. That would be perfect, Lily said, leading them back into the teaching room. For the next hour, Alexander sat quietly in the corner, watching as Lily worked with Grace on a Chopin nocturne. Her teaching style was unlike anything he had experienced. There was technical instruction, yes, but always connected to the emotional purpose behind it. When Grace struggled with a difficult passage, Lily didn't just correct her finger positioning. She asked what the music was trying to say at that moment, and how Grace's technique could serve that message. After Grace's lesson, Alexander observed Lily with other students, a middle-aged woman returning to piano after decades away, a restless 10-year-old boy who couldn't sit still until Lily found ways to make the lesson feel like play, an elderly man with arthritic hands who wanted to learn jazz standards. With each student, Lily adapted her approach while keeping the same core philosophy. That music was, above all, about connection. Connection to the composer's intention, to one's own emotions, and to the listeners who would receive the gift of the performance. By the end of the day, Alexander's head was swimming with new ideas. Over dinner at a local restaurant, he peppered Lily with questions. How do you balance it? He asked. Technical skill is still necessary. You can't just play with feeling if your hands can't execute what your heart intends. Of course not, Lily agreed, breaking off a piece of bread. Technique matters. But as a means, not an end. I believe we should practice technique until it becomes second nature, and then we can focus on what we're really trying to say through the music. That's not how I was taught, Alexander said, thinking of his childhood teachers who drilled scales and arpeggios for hours, who measured success in metronome markings and competition placements. I know, Lily said gently. And it gave you extraordinary ability. No one can deny that, but at what cost? Alexander was silent, considering her question. The cost had been high. A childhood with few friends. Parents who saw him as an investment rather than a son. A young adulthood defined by constant competition. and an adult life that, despite its external success, had left him feeling strangely empty. "Tomorrow is our spring recital," Lily said, changing the subject. "Nothing fancy, just the students sharing what they've learned. Would you like to attend?" "I'd love to," Alexander replied, finding that he genuinely meant it. The recital was held in the community center, a simple building with folding chairs set up facing an upright piano that had seen better days. Parents, grandparents, and friends filled the seats, programs in hand, talking excitedly as they waited for the performances to begin. Alexander sat in the back row, feeling oddly nervous on behalf of the students. He remembered his own first recitals, the pressure to be perfect, the cold disappointment when he wasn't. Lily stepped to the front of the room, thanking everyone for coming and explaining that today was about celebration, not perfection. "Music is a journey," she said warmly, "and today is just a chance to share where we are on that journey." One by one, the students performed. Some played beautifully, some struggled through simple pieces, hitting wrong notes or losing the rhythm. But what struck Alexander was the atmosphere in the room. There was no tension, no sense that anyone was being judged or found wanting. Each performance, regardless of its technical merit, was met with genuine appreciation. When Grace played her Chopin Nocturne, Alexander found himself deeply moved. Her technique wasn't flawless. She would need more work before she was ready for conservatory auditions, but there was an authenticity to her playing that many technically superior pianists never achieved. After the final student, Lily turned to the audience with a smile. "We have a very special guest with us today. Many of you may recognize the name Alexander Reed, one of the world's premier concert pianists. He's been kind enough to visit our little town and observe our music program. Alexander, would you honor us with a piece?" Alexander hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared anything, hadn't practiced for a performance. For a moment, panic flared in his chest, the old fear of being anything less than perfect in front of an audience. But as he walked to the piano, he looked at the faces of the students who had just performed with such courage and joy. If they could share their musical journeys, flaws and all, couldn't he do the same? He sat at the worn, upright piano, so different from the concert grands he was used to. The action was heavier, some keys slightly out of alignment, but as he began to play a Debussy piece that had always spoken to him, he found himself caring less about technical perfection and more about the connection he felt with the music and with the audience. He played not as Alexander Reed, world-renowned pianist, but simply as a human being sharing something beautiful with other human beings. When he finished, the applause wasn't the polished, almost obligatory response of concert hall patrons, but the genuine, enthusiastic appreciation of people who had been touched by what they heard. As he stood to bow, Alexander caught Lily's eye. She was smiling at him with something like pride, as if he were one of her students who had just overcome a significant challenge, and in a way, he supposed he had. After the recital, as parents and students mingled over punch and cookies, Alexander found himself surrounded by people asking questions about his career, his training, his experiences. But unlike the usual post-performance conversations with wealthy patrons or industry insiders, these questions came from a place of genuine curiosity and shared love of music. "Will you be staying in town long?" asked Thomas, Lily's husband, as the crowd began to disperse. "I fly back to New York tomorrow," Alexander replied. "But I'm considering some changes when I get back." "What kind of changes?" Lily asked, joining them. Alexander smiled. "I think it might be time for me to try teaching." The surprise on her face gave way to understanding. "You'd be good at it," she said. "Especially now." "I had a good example to follow," he replied, holding her gaze for a moment before Thomas called her away to help one of her younger students who was looking for her. As Alexander watched Lily move through the room, connecting with each person, he felt a certainty growing within him. The path forward wasn't about more prestigious concerts or competition judging or critical acclaim. It was about finding what music was really for: connection, expression, shared humanity, and helping others discover the same truth. Vienna would have to find another judge. Alexander Reed had more important work to do. 1 year later, the hallways of the Reed Music Foundation hummed with activity. In what was once a neglected community center on the edge of New York City, a dozen practice rooms now echoed with scales, etudes, and the occasional burst of laughter. Students of all ages and backgrounds came here, some with dreams of concert careers, others simply seeking the joy of creating music. Alexander stood in the doorway of the main teaching room, watching as a teenage boy hunched over the piano, his face screwed up in concentration as he worked through a difficult passage of Beethoven. "Remember what we talked about, Kevin," Alexander said quietly. "The notes are just the beginning. What is Beethoven trying to tell us here?" The boy paused, thinking. "It's like he's asking a question, and then answering it himself?" "Exactly," Alexander nodded approvingly. "So how can your playing make us hear both the question and the answer?" Kevin took a deep breath and began again. This time there was a subtle difference, a thoughtfulness to his phrasing, a sense of the music as conversation rather than just sounds. "It wasn't perfect, but it was alive." "Much better," Alexander said when the boy finished. "Practice that section with that intention in mind and we'll work on it more next week." As Kevin packed up his sheet music, Alexander checked his watch. "I need to prepare for the master class. Will you be staying for it?" "Wouldn't miss it," Kevin replied with a grin. "Mom's bringing my little sister too. She wants to start lessons next year." After Kevin left, Alexander straightened the room, adjusting the piano bench and organizing the sheet music that always seemed to migrate around the space, no matter how carefully he tried to keep it in order. The master class today was special, the culmination of a year's work with his advanced students, and they would be playing for a guest teacher he especially respected. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Just landed. Taxi stuck in traffic. Will be there in 20 minutes. Alexander smiled at the message from Lily, then headed to the main performance space where chairs had been arranged for today's audience. Mostly parents and other students, but also a few colleagues from his former life who had been intrigued by his career change. Walter, his former agent, still called occasionally with offers for concert tours or recording contracts, clearly hoping Alexander's phase of educational work would pass. But with each month that went by, Alexander became more certain he had found his true path. The Reed Music Foundation had started small, just Alexander and 2 part-time teachers offering affordable lessons to students who couldn't access traditional music education. But word had spread quickly. His name attracted attention, and his new teaching philosophy, so different from the rigid training he'd received, resonated with many who had been intimidated or discouraged by traditional approaches. "Alexander," a familiar voice called from the entrance. "This place is amazing." Lily stood there taking in the transformed community center with wide eyes. Her husband Thomas was beside her carrying her overnight bag. "You made it," Alexander said, crossing the room to greet them. "How was your flight?" "Bumpy but on time," Thomas replied, shaking Alexander's hand. "The taxi ride was worse than the turbulence." "Your text said 20 minutes, Alexander said to Lily with a raised eyebrow. She laughed. The driver found a shortcut. "Is there time for a tour before we start?" Alexander showed them around the facility, pride evident in his voice as he explained each space. There were practice rooms with pianos of varying quality, from basic uprights for beginners to a concert grand in the performance space. A small recording studio allowed students to document their progress. A library held sheet music and books about composers, music theory, and musical history. The community donated most of the books, Alexander explained. And some of the instruments, too. People had pianos sitting unused in their homes and were happy to give them a new purpose. "It's wonderful," Lily said sincerely. "How many students do you have now?" "Over 100 taking regular lessons, and we run free weekend workshops for anyone who wants to try an instrument without committing to lessons. We never turn away a student who can't afford to pay. We have a scholarship fund for that." Thomas whistled. "That's quite a change from international competitions and concert halls." Alexander nodded. "It is, and I've never been happier." They made their way back to the performance space, which was now filling with people. Alexander's advanced students sat in the front row, sheet music clutched in nervous hands, sneaking glances at Lily. Alexander had told them about the small-town piano teacher who had changed his perspective on music, and they were clearly curious about her. "I'll let you get settled," Alexander told Lily. "The master class will start in 15 minutes. There's coffee and tea in the break room if you need it." "I'm ready whenever you are," she assured him. When Alexander returned after making sure all his students had arrived, he found Lily chatting easily with a group of parents, her warmth and genuine interest in their children immediately breaking down any barriers of celebrity or intimidation. At exactly 2 o'clock, Alexander called the room to attention. "Welcome, everyone, to our spring masterclass. Today we're honored to have a very special guest teacher, someone whose approach to music has deeply influenced my own teaching philosophy. Please welcome Mrs. Lily Chen." The applause was warm as Lily took her place beside Alexander at the front of the room. Mrs. Chen will be working with our advanced students today, sharing her unique perspective on musical interpretation. "I've told you all how Mrs. Chen and I met. You challenged her to a piano duel and lost," called out one of the teenage students, prompting laughter from the group. Alexander smiled good-naturedly. "That's one way to put it. I prefer to say she opened my eyes to a different way of understanding music, and that's what I hope she'll do for you today." Lily stepped forward. "Before we begin, I want to make something clear. I'm not here because I'm the most technically accomplished pianist. Many of you in this room, including most of Mr. Reed's advanced students, can probably play more difficult pieces than I can. I'm here because Mr. Reed and I share a belief that music is about more than technical achievement. It's about communication, connection, and expressing what words alone cannot say." The master class proceeded with each student performing a prepared piece, followed by Lily's gentle but insightful guidance. She had a gift for identifying exactly where a performance was technically correct but emotionally disconnected, and for asking just the right questions to help students discover how to bridge that gap. Alexander watched from the side, occasionally adding a comment, but mostly allowing Lily to work her magic. He couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come in the year since they had met. From a pianist who measured success in technical perfection and critical acclaim to a teacher who valued growth, authenticity, and the uniquely personal relationship each student developed with music. After the final student performed, Alexander stepped forward. "To close our masterclass today, Mrs. Chen and I would like to play something for you. This is a piece we've been working on together over the past few months, sending recordings back and forth." Whispers of excitement ran through the audience as Alexander and Lily sat at the twin grand pianos that had been positioned at the front of the room. They looked at each other, nodded once, and began. The piece was Rachmaninoff's Suite No. 2 for 2 pianos, a challenging work that demanded both technical skill and deep musical understanding from both performers. As they played, the differences in their styles became apparent. Alexander's precise, controlled approach balanced by Lily's more intuitive, emotional interpretation. But rather than clashing, these differences created a conversation between the two pianos, each voice distinct but harmonizing perfectly with the other. The audience sat transfixed as the music filled the room. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence before enthusiastic applause erupted. As they took their bows, Alexander caught Lily's eye and saw his own joy reflected there. This was what music was for, not to impress or compete or achieve status, but to share, to connect, to communicate across differences. Later, after the audience had dispersed and the students had gone home, Alexander, Lily, and Thomas sat in the now quiet performance space, talking softly over cups of tea. "Your foundation is doing incredible work," Lily said. "These students are lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Alexander replied. "If I hadn't met you, I'd still be chasing perfection and missing the whole point of music." "Speaking of the foundation," Thomas said, "Lily has something she wants to discuss with you." Lily set down her teacup. "Our town has been trying to restart the music program in the public schools for years, but we've never had enough qualified teachers or resources. I've been wondering if your foundation might consider opening a branch there. We have plenty of interested students, but not enough structure or support." Alexander sat up straighter, intrigued by the idea. "A second location? I hadn't thought about expanding yet, but—" "It's just a thought," Lily said quickly, "something to consider for the future." "No, it's a good thought," Alexander said, mind already racing with possibilities. "We could start small. Weekend workshops, a few regular teachers. Grace is graduating from conservatory next year, isn't she? She might be interested in teaching." They spent the next hour sketching ideas, their excitement growing as the vision took shape. A network of music education centers accessible to all, combining the best of classical training with a more holistic, emotionally connected approach. As the conversation wound down, Thomas yawned and mentioned heading back to their hotel. But Alexander had one more question for Lily. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. "That night at the charity gala when I challenged you to play, were you nervous? Did you think I was going to humiliate you?" Lily considered the question, then smiled. "I was nervous, yes, but not because I feared being humiliated. I was nervous because I saw something in you, a brilliant musician who had lost his connection to the heart of music. I wasn't sure if my playing could help you find it again." "It did more than that," Alexander said quietly. "It changed everything." As they walked together toward the exit, Alexander paused to look back at the twin pianos on the small stage, still positioned as they had left them after their duet. Once, he had seen music as a battleground, a place to prove his superiority. Now he understood it was a meeting place, between musician and composer, between performer and audience, between one heart and another. The small-town piano teacher hadn't just won their impromptu duel that night at the charity gala. She had shown him there was no need for duels at all. In music, as in life, the greatest achievements came not from competition but from harmony. Different voices coming together to create something more beautiful than any could produce alone.